I woke up that morning to what I thought was the sound of woodpeckers hammering at the side of my house, only to realize seconds later that it wasn't birds at all but the sharp crack of gunfire, and when I looked outside through the blinds my jaw nearly hit the floor because there was Karen, our beloved HOA president, standing in my driveway with a revolver pointed at my outdoor Wi-Fi router, as if it had personally insulted her, the sight so ridiculous that for a split second I thought maybe I was still dreaming. The absurdity of watching a 40-something woman in yoga pants and oversized sunglasses blasting away at a router box on a Tuesday morning nearly made me laugh, but then the router actually sparked, smoke curling into the air, and she turned toward my house screaming that I had no right to lock her out, that free Wi-Fi was a neighborhood necessity, that the HOA had voted for community internet, and I was committing some sort of crime by changing my password. Imagine being barely awake, coffee still brewing, and suddenly finding yourself the unwilling star of a suburban shootout between a woman obsessed with freeloading Netflix access and a poor router that never stood a chance. That was my morning, and that was the moment I knew this was going to turn into a full-blown war. I rushed out the front door, partly to stop her from doing any more damage, and partly because I couldn't believe this was real life. She was red in the face, panting, and waving her gun around like she was starring in some Western showdown. When she saw me she launched into a tirade about how selfish I was, how everyone in the cul-de-sac had been using my Wi-Fi for years, how it was basically a community utility, and now that I had the audacity to update the password she couldn't even send her emails or stream her crime shows. I pointed at the smoldering router box and asked if she had lost her mind, which earned me a shriek about how the signal had been too weak anyway and she was just teaching the machine a lesson. I pulled my phone out and dialed the sheriff because there was no way I was letting this situation go undocumented, and as I spoke to dispatch neighbors began poking their heads out of doors and windows, drawn by the noise. Phones appeared instantly, because nothing in our neighborhood spreads faster than gossip or video evidence of Karen mid-meltdown. When the sheriff's car rolled in 10 minutes later, Karen was pacing my lawn like a general preparing for battle, still lecturing me about the importance of community Wi-Fi and threatening to bring it up at the next HOA meeting. The deputy stepped out, took one look at the bullet holes in the router casing, and then looked at me as if silently asking whether this was some kind of prank. I showed him the revolver still clutched in Karen's hand, and to my relief he gently but firmly took it from her while she screamed about freedom of connection and internet oppression. The man was doing his best not to laugh, but when she insisted that the HOA bylaws gave her permission to shoot at my router because it was technically visible from the street, even the sheriff couldn't hold a straight face. He told her sternly that discharging a firearm in a residential neighborhood was a crime, but she immediately pivoted to tears, claiming I had left her no choice by cutting off her access to what she called her lifeline. By then a small crowd of neighbors had gathered, some filming, some hiding smiles, others clearly wishing they had popcorn for the show. The sheriff wrote up a report, confiscated the gun, and told Karen she would be summoned later, but he didn't arrest her on the spot because he said it would have to go through the county attorney first. That infuriated me, but I stayed calm because I knew what Karen hated most was not getting the rise out of people she was trying to provoke. She stomped away muttering about lawsuits and the dangers of technological tyranny. I stared at my ruined router box, wires dangling like intestines, and sighed, already calculating the hassle of calling the internet company. One of my neighbors whispered that I should be careful, because Karen wasn't going to let this go. I nodded, knowing he was right, because in the 10 years I had lived here I had learned one undeniable truth. Karen never backed down, no matter how insane the battle was. Later that day, after replacing the router and setting up a fresh network, I sat down with my wife and kids to strategize. My son Max, who is a bit of a tech prodigy, grinned at the idea of turning this whole situation into a game of digital cat and mouse. My wife, on the other hand, was furious and wanted to call our lawyer immediately. I told them I would handle it step by step, because escalating too quickly would give Karen the drama she craved. Still, I couldn't get the image out of my head of her screaming about free Wi-Fi while gun smoke drifted past her oversized sunglasses. It was simultaneously terrifying and hilarious, and I knew she would spin this into something even more absurd by the time the HOA meeting rolled around. By the next morning, rumors were already swirling. Apparently Karen had gone door to door telling people I had unlawfully stolen the internet from the community, as if I had personally reached into their homes and ripped Netflix from their televisions. A few freeloaders were grumbling, but most of the neighborhood was quietly entertained, waiting to see what would happen next. My phone buzzed constantly with texts from neighbors sending memes and jokes about Wi-Fi wars and router shootouts, but underneath the humor there was a nervousness because we all knew Karen was relentless. She had once dragged a neighbor through small claims court because his mailbox was painted the wrong shade of beige. She had organized a petition to have another neighbor's dog banned for barking too much. Compared to those petty crusades, a war over Wi-Fi felt like the most dangerous conflict yet. I decided to quietly start documenting everything, because if Karen had taught me anything, it was that the truth alone was not enough. You needed receipts, evidence, and a calm demeanor when the storm hit. I photographed the bullet-riddled router box before disposing of it, kept the sheriff's incident report in a folder, and began writing down every encounter with her. Part of me hated that it had come to this, but another part of me knew that standing up to her was necessary. She had ruled this neighborhood with intimidation and theatrics for too long, and if the hill I had to defend was my Wi-Fi password, then so be it. That evening, while grilling in the backyard, I heard Karen on the other side of the fence loudly telling another neighbor that she had been forced to take action because of my selfishness, and that the HOA would soon pass a resolution mandating open networks for everyone. I nearly choked on my burger. The idea of a suburban community enforcing free Wi-Fi like some kind of socialist internet commune was so absurd I almost laughed out loud, but I bit my tongue because giving her attention was like adding gasoline to fire. Instead, I made a quiet vow to outsmart her, because while she had passion and volume on her side, I had patience, technology, and a neighborhood full of witnesses. The sheriff's car had barely pulled away when I realized that the gunfire at my router was only the opening act, because by the time the HOA board meeting rolled around the next evening, Karen had transformed the story into a community-wide emergency. She marched into the clubhouse wearing a scarf like she was leading a protest march, slapping her binder down on the long oak table at the front of the room and declaring that our neighborhood was suffering a humanitarian crisis because I had single-handedly destroyed the community's internet freedom. The clubhouse was packed, standing room only, neighbors whispering and rolling their eyes, some clearly entertained while others nervously shuffled because they had been mooching off my Wi-Fi too. Karen had gathered her small but vocal faction, a few neighbors who loved the idea of free internet and couldn't believe I had dared to disrupt their late-night streaming marathons. She announced to everyone that she was introducing a motion to require all residents to share their Wi-Fi networks with the community, a rule she insisted was within the HOA's power to enforce under some vague clause about communal resources. I sat in the back with my wife, who muttered under her breath that she should have brought popcorn because the whole thing was shaping up like a live comedy show. The debate began with Karen dramatically recounting the so-called attack on her right. She conveniently left out the detail about shooting at my router and instead told the crowd that I had cut her off without warning, leaving her unable to complete important HOA business, pay her bills online, or keep up with news that affects us all. She even pulled out a stack of printouts showing headlines about global events, claiming she had been unable to read them because I had maliciously locked her out of the internet. Several people stifled laughter, but a few of her allies nodded gravely as if I had committed some crime against humanity. One elderly neighbor timidly raised her hand and asked if the HOA really had the authority to force residents to share Wi-Fi, and Karen pounced on the opportunity, flipping to a highlighted section of the bylaws that mentioned community resources, without acknowledging that it referred to things like landscaping and trash pickup, not private internet service. My wife whispered that if Karen's interpretation held, she would probably argue that our refrigerators should be considered community pantries next. When my turn came to speak, I stood calmly and explained that I paid for my internet service like everyone else and that I had every legal right to protect my connection with a password. I pointed out that Karen's behavior was dangerous, that she had discharged a firearm on my property, and that any discussion of shared Wi-Fi was absurd. Karen immediately interrupted, waving her arms and accusing me of exaggerating, saying she had never shot at anything but merely fired warning shots near the router casing, which apparently in her mind was a completely different matter. The room erupted with laughter and murmurs, and the HOA president, who was clearly weary of Karen's antics but too spineless to confront her directly, tried to steer the meeting back to order. Karen wasn't having it. She declared that technology was too important to be hoarded and that the spirit of community demanded sacrifice from all of us. One of her allies chimed in, complaining that his internet bill was too high and that it was unfair that some of us had strong connections while others struggled. I asked him if he had considered simply paying for a better plan, and he looked at me like I had suggested he buy a yacht. The turning point of the meeting came when my son Max quietly stood up from the back, laptop in hand, and explained in simple terms that Wi-Fi signals are private property and that forcing everyone to share would not only be illegal but would also create massive security risk. He pointed out that anyone on an open network could access banking information, personal files, or worse, and as he spoke he projected a quick demonstration onto the screen showing how easy it would be for someone to snoop on their neighbor if networks were left open. The room gasped when he pulled up a harmless but hilarious example: Karen's public social media page filled with rants about local stores and endless selfies with her cat. The demonstration got laughs from even some of her own supporters, and Karen turned beet red, shouting that Max had hacked her, which of course he hadn't since the page was already public. My wife leaned over to me with a grin and whispered that the kid was going to win this war for us, one keystroke at a time. Still, Karen wasn't about to back down. She pulled out a petition she had already drafted and demanded signatures from anyone who believed in what she called Wi-Fi justice. A few of her allies scribbled their names, but most people refused, and some openly mocked the idea. I could see Karen's confidence waver, but she quickly rallied, threatening to bring the matter to a vote at the next meeting, whether anyone liked it or not. The HOA president sighed heavily and moved on to the next agenda item, clearly eager to shut the circus down, but the damage had been done. Karen had managed to plant the seed of a bizarre new crusade, and though most of the neighborhood thought it was ridiculous, everyone also knew she had a way of turning ridiculous ideas into prolonged battles. After the meeting ended, I overheard neighbors whispering about how insane the situation had become, but there were also a few who looked worried, likely realizing that their days of free streaming from my connection were over. One neighbor even joked that he would rather pay for my internet directly than have Karen dictate Wi-Fi laws. I went home that night with mixed feelings. On the one hand, Karen's motion was clearly doomed, but on the other hand, I knew she wasn't going to stop. She thrived on these fights. If she lost at the board meeting, she would escalate in some new, even stranger way. I could already feel the pressure building, the sense that this was just the second act of a drama that was far from over. Sure enough, the very next day I noticed unusual activity around Karen's house. She was outside with a ladder and a pair of binoculars, pointing them at my home like she was mapping out a battle plan. A few hours later, I spotted her cousin lugging an ancient laptop and a long antenna onto her porch. My son Max confirmed what I suspected. They were trying to hack into my network using some kind of jury-rigged setup. I could have called the sheriff right then, but instead I decided to play along. Max was giddy at the chance to set up digital traps, explaining that we could lure them into connecting to a fake network and let them embarrass themselves. My wife wasn't thrilled with the idea, but I told her that sometimes the best revenge is letting Karen dig her own grave. As the sun set and the glow of the cousin's outdated laptop flickered across Karen's porch, I felt a strange mix of amusement and anticipation. The Wi-Fi war had gone from bullets to board meetings, and now it was shifting into the digital arena. Karen thought she could outsmart us, but she had no idea she was about to walk straight into Max's carefully laid snare. I woke the next morning to the faint hum of equipment across the street, and when I peeked through the curtains I saw exactly what I had feared. Karen had turned her front yard into a makeshift command center with her cousin crouched on the porch beside an old folding table cluttered with wires, a battered laptop, and what looked like a giant homemade antenna that was now pointed directly at my house, as if they were preparing to intercept messages from outer space. She stood behind him like a general, barking orders and sipping her oversized iced coffee while gesturing wildly at my roof, as though she was about to lead an invasion. I wanted to laugh at the sight because it looked like something out of a low-budget spy film, but the seriousness in her posture made it clear she wasn't playing around. This wasn't just her usual neighborhood meddling anymore, this was a full-scale escalation of the Wi-Fi war. My son Max, who had been waiting for this exact moment with the excitement of a gamer about to start a final boss battle, leaned over my shoulder and whispered that it was time to deploy our counterattack. He had been preparing a decoy network he called free HOA Wi-Fi, which would act as bait, and anyone who tried to connect would immediately be funneled into a page designed to expose their browsing habits and force them to reveal themselves. My wife shook her head and muttered that we were enabling madness, but I argued that sometimes the only way to handle a bully was to let them trip over their own schemes. By mid-morning Karen's cousin was hunched over the keyboard, frowning, clearly struggling with whatever outdated software he was running. We sat in our living room watching from a safe distance as Max monitored the decoy network, waiting. When the name Free HOA Wi-Fi popped up on Karen's screen, her cousin lit up, and within minutes they were frantically typing, convinced they had struck gold. Max smirked as lines of code scrolled across his screen, confirming that their laptop had fallen into the trap. Almost instantly their device began displaying a fake browsing log that Max had carefully fabricated, filled with absurd search histories like how to be less nosy, affordable anger management classes, and cat costumes for middle-aged women. From our couch we burst into laughter as we could hear Karen shrieking accusations from across the street, yelling at her cousin for embarrassing her and demanding to know why the internet seemed to be mocking her personally. Max had even added a pop-up that flashed the words "Welcome back, Karen, the internet missed you," which sent her into a full-blown rage audible from my front lawn. The spectacle drew neighbors out once again, people strolling by under the guise of walking their dogs but really stopping to watch Karen stomp her feet and fling her iced coffee into the bushes. She screamed that she was being spied on, that hackers were targeting her personally, and that I must have hired someone to sabotage her. Her cousin looked ready to melt into the pavement, mumbling that maybe the laptop wasn't strong enough for the job. My wife filmed discreetly from our upstairs window, capturing every moment because by this point we had learned that with Karen, evidence was worth its weight in gold. The funniest part was when Karen, in a fit of paranoia, accused the sky of being filled with government drones and demanded that her cousin point the antenna higher to block them, which only made the device collapse and crash into her flower bed. The neighbors tried to stifle their laughter, but more than one phone was clearly recording, and I knew these clips would be making the rounds on social media by nightfall. But the battle wasn't over. After retreating inside to regroup, Karen emerged later in the afternoon with a new tactic. She marched directly up to my door and pounded on it until I opened. Her face was flushed, hair frizzed, and eyes blazing with indignation as she shouted that she had undeniable proof I was running an illegal spy operation. She waved a stack of screenshots that she had clearly printed from Max's decoy network logs, accusing me of violating her privacy by hacking into her personal searches. I almost choked trying not to laugh, because she had walked straight into the trap and now was holding the evidence against herself as if it were my crime. I calmly told her that I had no idea what she was talking about, that my Wi-Fi was secured, and that perhaps she should ask herself how she had gotten those logs in the first place. She sputtered and threatened to call the sheriff again, which I encouraged her to do. She stormed off, muttering about conspiracies and government regulation of technology, while neighbors who had been watching from their porches clapped quietly as if they had just witnessed a stage performance. Later that evening I sat down with my family and we reflected on how quickly the situation had spiraled into farce. What had started as Karen firing bullets at my router had now become a digital Cold War filled with hacking attempts, fake networks, and public meltdowns. Max was practically glowing with pride, already brainstorming more traps in case Karen escalated again. He wanted to create a network that looped her device into an endless stream of goat videos, which I had to admit would be hilarious, but my wife cautioned that we were walking a fine line and that we needed to be careful not to let this spiral into something even more dangerous. She was right, of course, because as funny as it was, Karen's unpredictability made every step risky. This was a woman who had already pulled a gun on my property, and if she felt cornered there was no telling what she might do next. The next day the neighborhood was buzzing, not just with gossip but with actual news coverage. Someone had posted clips of Karen's meltdown to social media, and they had gone viral locally, with comments pouring in about the absurdity of someone waging war over Wi-Fi. Reporters started circling, sniffing out a story about a suburban HOA battle gone haywire. Karen, predictably, saw this as her moment to shine. She gave a dramatic interview to a local station claiming she was the victim of cyber terrorism perpetrated by her own neighbors, painting herself as a hero standing up for digital freedom. Watching her spin the narrative on live television made me realize she wasn't embarrassed at all. In fact, she was thriving on the attention. She even coined a slogan, "Community Wi-Fi is a human right," and plastered it on signs she stuck in her front yard. Max nearly fell out of his chair laughing, but my wife's expression was grim. She warned me that Karen's ability to manipulate the story meant we couldn't afford to sit back and just laugh anymore. We needed to prepare for something bigger. The courtroom smelled faintly of old paper and coffee, and the murmur of restless neighbors filled the air as I sat at the defendant's table, my lawyer shuffling papers beside me with the quiet confidence of a man who had seen 1,000 ridiculous cases but still couldn't quite believe this one was real. Karen marched in like she was arriving for a coronation, chin lifted, floral blouse fluttering dramatically, clutching a thick binder stuffed with what she clearly believed was irrefutable evidence. Behind her trailed a few of her loyal supporters, including her cousin with the outdated laptop, who looked more like a nervous accomplice than a witness. The judge, a weary middle-aged man with lines on his face that suggested decades of listening to nonsense, glanced over his glasses at the docket and sighed audibly when he read the case description aloud. Alleged harassment, property damage, and unlawful technological interference stemming from disputes over Wi-Fi access. A ripple of laughter went through the gallery, but Karen snapped her fingers at her supporters as if to silence them, then turned her glare on me as though this entire proceeding were a battle for the soul of the neighborhood. Karen launched her opening argument before the judge had even given her permission, ranting about how I had maliciously cut her off from the internet, how I had humiliated her publicly with my so-called hacker son, and how the entire community had suffered because I refused to provide free Wi-Fi. She used phrases like digital oppression and technological tyranny, waving her arms as though she were addressing Congress rather than a county courtroom. My lawyer let her ramble, scribbling notes and occasionally raising an eyebrow at me with a faint smile, the kind of smile that said we were about to dismantle her theatrics piece by piece. When the judge finally managed to interrupt and remind her to stick to relevant facts, she produced a stack of printed screenshots from the decoy network Max had created, shoving them at the bailiff as though they were classified government documents. She declared that I had hacked into her personal life and made her a laughingstock, her voice cracking with dramatic intensity as if she were reciting a monologue from a soap opera. Then it was our turn. My lawyer stood calmly, adjusted his tie, and began with a simple question to the judge. He asked whether the court considered it illegal for a homeowner to set a password on a private internet connection. The judge barely concealed a smirk as he answered no, Of course not. My lawyer then slid a photograph across the table of the bullet-riddled router box, pointing out that the only actual crime committed so far had been Karen discharging a firearm at my property. He called the sheriff to the stand, who testified in detail about the morning he had arrived to find Karen pacing my lawn with a revolver, ranting about community Wi-Fi. The sheriff's testimony was calm, straightforward, and devastatingly clear. Karen tried to interrupt repeatedly, shouting that the shots had been warnings and that she had been within her rights as HOA president to enforce community harmony, but each outburst only made her look more unhinged. The judge had to warn her twice about contempt of court. Next, my lawyer introduced evidence of her cousin's hacking attempts, complete with timestamps and logs provided by Mac. He explained how Karen had orchestrated repeated intrusions into my private network and even attempted to build illegal signal-boosting equipment to hijack my internet. Karen tried to spin this as experimentation for the good of the neighborhood, claiming she was running community tests, but the courtroom erupted in laughter when Max was called to testify. He explained in plain terms how he had created a decoy network and how Karen's cousin had fallen for it almost instantly, pulling up the absurd fake search histories that had been displayed on their laptop. When the judge asked Karen if she had, in fact, tried to connect to a network labeled free HOA Wi-Fi, she stammered and sputtered before admitting she had, but insisted she thought it was a government-provided resource. My lawyer seized on the admission, pointing out that she had knowingly attempted to access a network that did not belong to her, which was itself a violation. As the case unfolded, the mood in the courtroom shifted from tense to comical. Neighbors who had been called as witnesses testified about Karen's door-to-door campaign, her speeches about community Wi-Fi being a human right, and her attempts to intimidate anyone who didn't sign her petition. One elderly neighbor admitted she signed only because Karen had stood on her porch for nearly an hour, refusing to leave until she gave in. Another testified that Karen had threatened to fine people through the HOA if they didn't support her crusade, even though she had no actual authority to impose such fines. Each testimony chipped away at the image Karen was trying to project, revealing instead a pattern of harassment and bullying that the judge was clearly losing patience with. Then came the most dramatic moment of all. My lawyer played a short clip recorded by a neighbor during Karen's hacking meltdown, the one where she screamed that the internet was mocking her and accused the sky of being filled with government drones. The video played on the screen at the front of the courtroom, and despite Karen's shrieks of protest, the laughter that erupted was unstoppable. Even the judge had to pause for a moment to compose himself. Karen's face turned crimson as she realized how ridiculous she looked, but instead of backing down, she doubled down. She slammed her hand on the table and shouted that the entire neighborhood was conspiring against her, that I had manipulated everyone with lies, and that she would not be silenced. The judge finally had enough and ordered her to sit down, his voice sharp with authority, warning her that one more outburst would result in immediate contempt charges. In closing arguments, my lawyer calmly summarized the facts. I had legally secured my own property. Karen had trespassed, vandalized, harassed, and even endangered others by firing a weapon. Her claims of community rights had no legal basis. She had embarrassed herself with fabricated evidence and exposed her own misconduct. By contrast, all I had done was protect my household and document the chaos. Karen's lawyer, if one could call him that, was her cousin, and his attempt at a closing statement was so incoherent that the judge cut him off midway. The decision was swift. The judge ruled in my favor, ordered Karen to pay damages for the destroyed router and legal fees, and referred her firearm discharge to the district attorney for further action. He also issued a restraining order preventing her from harassing me or my family about internet access again. The weeks following the courtroom battle should have been peaceful, but peace was something Karen never allowed to exist for long. At first she sulked in her house, blinds drawn, her cousin's car parked out front less and less as if even he had finally realized that this crusade was hopeless. Neighbors whispered that maybe, just maybe, The humiliation in court had broken her spirit, that the restraining order and the judge's harsh words had finally tamed her relentless energy. But those whispers were wishful thinking, because by the second week I noticed signs in her yard reading Wi-Fi is a human right in big red letters, and at night she would stand on her porch giving speeches to no one, pretending that a crowd of supporters was listening as she promised to take her case to the state legislature. It was both hilarious and sad, like watching a self-appointed revolutionary leader without an army. My wife rolled her eyes and said she would burn out soon enough, but I wasn't so sure. Karen had the stamina of a marathon runner when it came to causing chaos, and her imagination was boundless when it came to inventing new ways to make herself the center of attention. Meanwhile, the judge's order required her to pay damages and legal fees, which she clearly didn't have. When she missed the first payment deadline, the HOA itself stepped in, because the ruling included a clause that held them partially responsible for enabling her nonsense. Suddenly the board, once her safe haven, turned on her with sharp resentment. They called an emergency meeting where even her longtime allies voted to strip her of her position as HOA president. The announcement was met with applause from nearly every household in the neighborhood. For the first time in years, Karen's grip on the HOA was broken, and people were smiling, joking, even planning small neighborhood get-togethers without fear of her storming in to shut them down. But Karen herself did not take the news quietly. She stormed into the meeting, banged on the table, and screamed that the HOA was a dictatorship now, that the people were being silenced, and that she was the only one brave enough to stand against technological oppression. The board members asked her to leave, and when she refused, security was called to escort her out, an image that quickly made its way onto social media and spread like wildfire. Within hours, clips of Karen being dragged from the clubhouse while shouting about free Wi-Fi were everywhere, turning her into a kind of viral spectacle. Strangers online mocked her, turned her rants into memes, and compared her to a cartoon villain. Instead of deterring her, this only fueled her sense of importance. She wasn't humiliated, she was convinced she was famous. It was around this time that I decided to take the one step I had resisted all along. I called my internet provider and arranged for a professional installation of a fiber optic system, not just for my house but with the option for the entire street to connect through a secure paid service. The provider loved the idea, offering me a discount in exchange for hosting the main node on my property. In less than a month, we had a shiny new fiber line running down the block, and neighbors lined up eagerly to sign contracts, thrilled at the idea of faster, more reliable service after years of struggling with spotty connections. The irony was delicious. By trying to force me to give away Wi-Fi for free, Karen had provoked me into helping install the strongest, most secure, and entirely paid internet infrastructure the neighborhood had ever seen. I couldn't have planned a more fitting outcome if I tried. The first time Karen tried to connect to the network, she was greeted with a login page demanding payment. She stormed across the street, pounded on my door, and demanded that I let her in for free. I simply pointed to the restraining order taped inside my front window and closed the door. Through the peephole, I saw her sputter, stomp, and storm back to her house. Minutes later she appeared on her porch holding a homemade protest sign that read "No fees for freedom," parading up and down the street chanting slogans that no one joined. It might have been funny if it wasn't so pitiful. As the weeks wore on, the neighborhood embraced the new network and Karen became more and more isolated. Kids who used to fear her wrath now mocked her openly, filming her rants and uploading them to the same internet she claimed was being stolen from her. Local reporters stopped showing up, bored of the story now that the court case was over. The only people who still paid attention were online trolls who enjoyed egging her on, encouraging her to escalate her protests. She took the bait, once staging a one-woman sit-in on my lawn until the sheriff removed her, another time attempting to cut the fiber line with garden shears, which resulted in her accidentally electrocuting herself just enough to knock her down without causing lasting harm. Each stunt only made her more of a laughingstock. My wife told me not to let her antics get to me, and she was right. I had already won. The neighborhood was calmer, friendlier, almost celebratory. We hosted a block party with food trucks and music, something unthinkable under Karen's reign, and the turnout was massive. People brought lawn chairs, shared stories, and raised toasts to the end of an era. For the first time, our community actually felt like a community, united not just by shared space but by shared relief. That night, as I watched the sun set over the party, neighbors laughing and children running through sprinklers, I realized just how much had changed. What had begun as a ridiculous feud over a Wi-Fi password had reshaped our entire neighborhood. Karen's downfall had liberated people, given them courage to stand up against her bullying, and created an environment where cooperation replaced fear. It was almost poetic. She had demanded free Wi-Fi, and in doing so, she had brought about a network that was stronger, faster, and more exclusive than ever, one that required the very thing she despised most: payment. In trying to win, she had orchestrated her own defeat, and in the process, she had given us exactly what we needed. The irony was so perfect it almost felt scripted. But of course, Karen being Karen, she didn't disappear completely. Every once in a while I would see her at the local Starbucks, hunched over a laptop, scowling at the screen as she used their free Wi-Fi for hours at a time. Sometimes she would glare at me when our eyes met, muttering to herself, still convinced she was the victim of some grand injustice. Yet even in her stubborn persistence, she had lost her power. She was no longer the queen of the HOA, no longer the terror of the cul-de-sac. She was just a woman on borrowed internet, a sideshow character in a story everyone else had moved past. And while part of me still worried she might find some new crusade, I also felt a sense of finality, as if this chapter of suburban warfare had truly closed. The neighborhood had survived the Wi-Fi wars, stronger and more united than before, and Karen's reign of chaos was over.